The first thing I noticed when I walked into the kitchen that morning was that the coffee was already made. The pot was full. She hadn't touched it. That struck me as strange, because Renata always had her first cup before I even got out of bed. I stood there in my socks on the linoleum, poured myself a mug, and listened to the house. It was quiet in the way houses get quiet when something is wrong. But nobody has said it yet. I was 57 years old. I had buried a wife, raised a daughter mostly on my own, put in 31 years at the same sheet metal fabrication plant outside of Knoxville, and I had done all of it with one person beside me who wasn't family. His name was Clifton, and if you want to understand everything that happened with Renata, you have to understand Clifton first. We met in 1987. I was 20 years old and had just started at the plant, scared and trying not to show it. Clifton was 22 and worked the station next to mine. He didn't say much that first week, neither did I. But on a Friday afternoon when my machine jammed and I didn't know what I was doing and the foreman was walking the floor, Clifton stepped over without being asked and had it cleared in about 45 seconds. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just went back to his station. I said thank you, and he nodded once. That was how it started. 36 years later, he was still the person I called when anything mattered. When my daughter Becca got into a car accident in 2009. When my wife passed in 2016. When the doctors found a nodule on my lung in 2021 that turned out to be nothing. But for 3 weeks I didn't sleep right, and Clifton drove 40 minutes each way twice a week just to sit on my porch and watch football with me so I wouldn't be alone with my thoughts. He never made me talk about it. He just showed up. The year before I married Renata, I had been in a dark place. Not the kind you can explain easily to people. My wife had been gone about 5 years. My daughter was living in Colorado, and I had been drinking more than I should have been. Not fall-down drunk, just a beer or two after work that became 3 or 4, and then some nights a glass of whiskey on top of that, and I stopped keeping track because I didn't want to know what the number was. Clifton was the one who said something, not in a dramatic way, not a sit-down intervention. We were fishing at the lake we'd been going to since our 30s, and he set down his rod and said, "You drinking too much, Walter?" Just like that. No lecture. No lecturinans. Just those 5 words? I told him to mind his business. He picked his rod back up and didn't say anything else for a while. Then he said, "I'll quit with you if you want. I'll do it the same day you do." He didn't have a problem himself. Never really did. But he said it anyway. I thought about that for 2 weeks. Then I called him on a Sunday morning and I said, "Monday." And he said, "All right." We both stopped on the same Monday. He drove to my house after work for the first 30 days, and we played cards or watched TV or just sat there. He didn't drink in front of me for over a year. When I asked him why he was going through all that trouble, he looked at me like I'd said something strange and said, "You'd do the same." I would have. He was right about that. So when I say you have to understand Clifton first, that's what I mean. That's the man I'm talking about, not just a friend. The person who decided to give something up permanently because I needed help putting mine down. I met Renata at a church cookout in the summer of 2022. She was warm and funny, and she laughed at things I said that weren't that funny, which I appreciated. She was 51, had been divorced once, had 2 grown kids she was close with. We dated for about 8 months, and it felt easy in a way that things hadn't felt easy in a long time. I thought that meant something good. We got married in March of 2023. Small wedding. Becca flew in from Colorado and stood up with me. Clifton was there. He shook Renata's hand and told her she was getting a good man, which made her laugh and made me a little embarrassed. The first few months were fine. Normal newlywed adjustments. She had opinions about how the living room should be arranged. I had habits around the house I'd had for 15 years. We worked through the small stuff without too much trouble. The first comment about Clifton came around September. We were in the car coming back from dinner, and I mentioned that I was going fishing with him that Saturday. She said, "You two spend a lot of time together." I said, "Yes, we'd been doing it for decades." She said, "I know. It's a lot." I told her Saturday fishing was something we'd done since before either of us knew she existed. She didn't respond to that and I let it go. But it didn't go. A month later, she made a remark about how Clifton called me on the phone too much. I'll be honest, he did call fairly often, 3-4 times a week, sometimes more. We'd always been that way. If one of us saw something funny or heard something on the news or had a work story, we called. That was just how it was. She started making a face when my phone rang, and it was him. Not a big face, just a small tightening around her eyes. Then came the comment at Thanksgiving. Her daughter and son-in-law were visiting, and we were all sitting around after dinner. And somehow Clifton came up, I don't even remember how, and Renata said, in front of everyone, "Walter's always with Clifton. If you want to find my husband, look for Clifton." She said it with a smile like a joke, but it wasn't a joke. Her daughter laughed politely. I changed the subject. That night, after everyone left and we were doing the dishes, I brought it up. I said that felt like a dig and I didn't appreciate it. She said she was just joking and I was being sensitive. I said there was nothing to joke about. She said, "Walter, normal grown men don't talk to another man every single day. It's unusual." I stood there with a dish towel in my hand and I looked at her and I said, "Clifton and I have been friends since we were in our 20s. That's not going to change." She rinsed a plate and didn't say anything. The escalation came in January. She had started making plans on the Saturdays I usually fished with Clifton. Little things, at first, errands she needed help with, a couple she wanted us to visit. I went along with some of it because I thought maybe she just wanted more of my time, and that seemed reasonable enough for a first year of marriage. But after the third or fourth time I noticed the pattern. It was always Saturday. It was always something that only came up that morning. I started paying closer attention. One evening in February I came home from an errand, and Renata was on the phone in the bedroom with the door partly closed. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I heard her say a name. The name was Howard, and I knew Howard was a man she worked with, and she was saying something about a situation at home, and I heard her say Clifton's name. I walked past the door to the kitchen. I made myself a glass of water. I stood there and I breathed. I didn't say anything that night, but I started being more careful. About 2 weeks later, she left her laptop open on the kitchen table and went to get something from the other room. I wasn't going through her things, but the email was right there on the screen. She had been emailing a woman named Patricia from her church, someone I'd met maybe twice, and in the email she was describing Clifton as unhealthy and saying she was at the end of her rope and that she needed Clifton out of Walter's life completely. She had written, "I don't know how much longer I can do this if things don't change." I stepped away from the table before she came back. I sat down on the sofa. I turned on the television. I watched the news without hearing a word of it. The thing that got me wasn't the anger, though there was plenty of that. It was how long this had clearly been going on inside her head. She had been building a case. She had been talking to people. And I had been sitting next to her at dinner every night thinking we were just going through an adjustment period. The demand came on a Sunday afternoon in March. We were sitting in the living room, and she said she wanted to talk, and I said, "All right." And she took a breath and said, "I need you to pull back from Clifton." Significantly. I asked what significantly meant. She said no more than once a month in person, and no more than one call a week. I asked her to repeat that. She did. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Renata, Clifton stopped drinking for a year because I was trying to get sober. He rearranged his life so I wouldn't have to do it alone." She said, "I know, and that was a long time ago." I said, "That's not the kind of thing that has an expiration date." She said she understood that, but this was about our marriage now. She said she felt like she came third in my life, after my daughter and after Clifton. I told her she didn't come third. She said it felt that way. I said feelings aren't always facts, and I know that didn't land well. But it was honest. She said, "I'm asking you to choose." I asked her to think carefully about whether she really wanted to phrase it that way. She said she already had. I told her I needed some air. I went out to the back porch and I sat in the cold for about 20 minutes. I watched the yard, the bare trees at the back of the property, a cardinal on the fence post. I didn't call Clifton that night. I wasn't ready to tell him what was happening. He would have said to try and work it out with her. He always said that kind of thing. Kept his opinions about my personal life careful and balanced unless I pushed him for a real answer. But I had seen that email, and there was something else I had to do first. I have a nephew who does IT work, not anything dramatic. He just knows his way around systems. I didn't ask him for anything illegal. I asked him if there was a way to find out whether Renata had spoken to an attorney. He told me to check with the county court records office, because initial consultations sometimes leave traces in family law scheduling systems if they're through certain legal aid networks. He walked me through how to look. It took me about 4 days. But I found it. She had scheduled not one, but 2 consultations with a family law attorney in February. paid the consultation fee both times. The second one was the week before she issued the ultimatum in the living room. I want to be clear about what I felt when I confirmed that. It wasn't surprise. By then, I think some part of me had already understood. It was more like something settling, like a picture coming into focus that you've been squinting at for a while. I called my own attorney on a Tuesday morning, a man named Garland who handled my late wife's estate and who I trusted. I told him the situation. He asked me some questions. We made a plan. I did not show my hand at home. Renata and I went on the way we had been mostly. We had dinner, we watched television. She asked once whether I'd thought more about the Clifton situation, and I said I was still working through it, which was true, just not in the way she meant. On a Thursday evening in April, I came home and set a manila envelope on the kitchen table. She asked what it was. I told her to open it. She looked at me while she opened it. Then she looked down at what was inside. The color left her face. I had never seen that happen to someone so quickly and so completely. She said, "Walter?" I said, "I found out about the consultations in February, both of them." She started to say something about how she had just been exploring her options. I let her finish. Then I said that I understood, and that it seemed like her options were already decided, and that I had simply decided to get there first. She said, "You didn't even try to talk to me." I said, "You went to an attorney in February and gave me an ultimatum in March. What exactly was I supposed to be talking about?" She didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't raise my voice. We had been married for just over a year, and part of me had genuinely wanted it to work, and that part was still there even then, and I think she could see it. But it was done. She had made her decision the same week she was sending emails to church friends about how she was at the end of her rope. I just hadn't known it yet. She moved to her daughter's house 3 weeks later. The divorce was final in September. It was not complicated. We didn't have much shared property. The house was mine before we married. She didn't fight it. Becca called me when it was over and asked how I was doing, and I told her the truth, which was that I was fine and also that I was tired in a way that didn't have much to do with sleep. She said that made sense. She said she was glad I'd had Clifton through all of it. I said so was I. I called Clifton a few days after the papers were filed. He already knew most of it by then. I had told him about the ultimatum a few weeks after it happened. He'd been careful about what he said, the way he always was. He didn't celebrate the divorce and he didn't mourn it either. He just listened and let me talk. When I called him that day to tell him it was final, there was a pause on the line, and then he said, "You doing all right?" I said I was. He said, "Good. I'll be over Saturday. I'll bring lunch." And that was the whole conversation. I'll bring lunch. And that was the whole conversation. He showed up Saturday at noon with sandwiches from the deli on Route 9 that we'd been going to since the 90s. We ate on the back porch and watched the yard and didn't talk about Renata much. He asked about Becca. I asked about his granddaughter who had just started walking. The cardinal came back to the fence post. I have thought a lot about what I would tell someone if they were going through something similar. A second marriage, late in life, that didn't go the way you expected. A partner who saw the most important friendship you had as a competition they needed to win. Here is what I know. A person who asks you to cut off someone who held you together at your worst moment isn't worried about your marriage. They're worried about something else, about not being able to reach the parts of you that another person already knows by heart. And the thing about Clifton is that Renata was never actually in competition with him. He wasn't filling a role she should have had. He was filling a role she simply couldn't because she hadn't been there. You can't catch up to 36 years. You can't earn that by marrying someone. It was already there when she arrived. I don't think she was a bad person. I think she was insecure and scared, and instead of saying that plainly, she built it into something strategic. And when it got strategic, it was already over. Because you can't come back from someone quietly lawyering up while telling you they just want to work things out. Becca came to visit in October after the divorce was final. We sat on that same back porch on a Saturday evening while Clifton was inside washing up after dinner. She looked out at the yard and she said, "Dad, I'm glad you didn't give him up." I said I never considered it for very long. She said, "I know." She paused. "When Mom died, he was the one who called me. You couldn't talk yet. He called me from his truck in the parking lot of the hospital, and he told me what happened, and he stayed on the phone with me for 2 hours while I figured out how to get to the airport. Did you know that?" I didn't know that. I sat with it. She said, "I never told you because it seemed like something between him and me, but I think you should know." I looked at the back door. Clifton was in there running water and probably complaining to himself about the state of my dish rack the way he always did. There are people in your life who choose to show up when they don't have to, when there's nothing convenient about it, when nobody would fault them for stepping back. Clifton had been making that choice since 1987 and had never once made me feel like it cost him anything. Even when I knew it did, I chose him. I would choose him again, and I went inside to argue with him about the dish rack. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, not to relitigate it, not to assign blame in the way people do when they're still angry, just to look at it clearly and understand what it was. What I know now is that Renata wasn't threatened by Clifton the person. She was threatened by what Clifton represented, evidence of a life I had already lived fully before she arrived, a version of me she had no access to and couldn't rewrite. When someone has known you at your worst and chosen to stay, that's a kind of loyalty that doesn't need explaining or competing with. But some people can't see it that way. Some people look at something they can't control and decide it needs to be removed. That's not cruelty necessarily, that's fear. But fear that turns into strategy, into secret consultations, into quiet legal planning while still sharing a dinner table. That's where I stop feeling sympathetic. Because at that point, it isn't about the marriage anymore. It's about winning. The cause and effect of the whole thing is plain to me now. Renata built a private case for months before she ever said a word to my face. And because she was building a case instead of having a conversation, she never gave us a real chance. Every time I thought we were adjusting to each other, she was actually preparing her exit. The ultimatum wasn't a plea. It was a test she expected me to fail, so she'd have grounds to leave on her terms. What I learned from that is something I wish I'd understood earlier in life. The way a person handles what they can't control tells you everything. Clifton was something Renata couldn't control, so she tried to eliminate him. When that didn't work fast enough, she moved to legal strategy. And when I moved first, she was genuinely stunned, because she had never once considered that I might be paying attention. I had spent years learning to pay attention. Getting sober will do that to you. When you stop numbing yourself, you start noticing everything. The small signals, the patterns in people's behavior, the things that don't add up. That's not cynicism. That's just what it means to be present in your own life. The wisest thing Clifton ever did for me wasn't stopping drinking alongside me, though that mattered more than I can say. It was the way he did it without making me feel like a burden. He understood that real support doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. Saturday after Saturday, phone call after phone call. Sandwich from the deli on Route 9 when the papers are finally signed and there's nothing left to say except pass the chips and argue about the dish rack. That's what integrity looks like in practice. Not in the grand moments, in the ordinary ones. I don't regret the marriage. I think it taught me things about myself I needed to learn, mostly about what I'm willing to tolerate and what I'm not. But I know that the best decision I made throughout the whole ordeal was the simplest one. I didn't panic. I didn't react. I paid attention. I got informed, and I moved when the time was right. That's the only lesson I pass on to anyone going through something similar. Not to be cold, not to be strategic for its own sake, but to stay clear-eyed about what's actually happening, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. Because the moment you let the emotions swamp the thinking is the moment someone else takes the wheel. I chose Clifton. I'd choose him again before the sentence was finished.